At 9:01 on the night of January 3, 1961, an alarm went off at a fire station near Idaho Falls, Idaho. Calls out that way were usually routine. A barn fire, a road accident, something ordinary that required one engine and 20 minutes to resolve. The responders who drove toward the National Reactor Testing Station in those first minutes had no particular reason to expect anything different. The station was a familiar fixture of the eastern Idaho landscape, a federal installation covering nearly 900 square miles of high desert where the Atomic Energy Commission had been quietly building and testing nuclear reactors since the late 1940s. 14 experimental reactors operated there at various points during the 1950s, part of America's post-war effort to develop nuclear technology across every conceivable application. Power generation, naval propulsion, military logistics, and whatever else the Cold War imagination could produce. For most people in Idaho Falls, the facility was government property you didn't ask too many questions about. It generated jobs and federal dollars and operated behind enough institutional opacity that public scrutiny was limited. When the responders got close enough to take radiation readings, their instruments pegged at the maximum and refused to register anything beyond that point. They pulled back. They called for specialists. Nobody on that initial crew knew yet what had happened inside the low concrete building at the end of the access road. The building's exterior was intact. Nothing visible suggested a disaster of any particular magnitude. It looked like a maintenance shed in the middle of a desert. The radiation readings it was emitting told a different story, and the agency responsible for that building was already moving to control what story would eventually reach the public. What the radiation protection teams found when they suited up and entered is one of the most disturbing scenes in the recorded history of American nuclear power. 2 men were dead on the floor. A third had been launched upward by the force of the explosion and impaled through the shoulder on a control rod that had driven itself through his body and into the ceiling. He was pinned 8 feet off the ground, still alive when the first crew reached him. He died before they could bring him down. The bodies were so intensely radioactive that teams could not remain in the building long enough to retrieve them on the first attempt. Dosimeters hit safe limits within minutes of entry, forcing rotations in and out that stretched the recovery effort across several hours of slow, careful, measured work. When the men were finally brought out, the corpses registered so high on radiation meters that standard burial was not an option. All 3 were interred in lead-lined caskets inside lead-lined vaults. Their internal organs were surgically removed, sealed in separate containers, and buried independently as radioactive waste, because those organs, having absorbed the direct radiation output of the explosion, could no longer be treated as human tissue under any existing safety classification. The Atomic Energy Commission's communications in the days following were measured and minimal. Officials confirmed there had been an incident at the National Reactor Testing Station. They confirmed there were fatalities. They described the event preliminarily as an accident involving a small experimental reactor. They did not characterize the scale of the radiation released. They did not describe the scene. They did not say anything that would require them to say more. This was the SL-1 disaster, the first nuclear accident in American history to cause immediate deaths, and one of the most deliberately managed cover-ups in the country's nuclear record. The official account said it was an accident. 3 Army soldiers performing routine maintenance on a small experimental reactor during a holiday shutdown had inadvertently pulled a control rod too far. A steam explosion had destroyed the reactor in a fraction of a second. Tragic. Unavoidable. Nobody's fault. That account left out almost everything that actually mattered. The SL-1, Stationary Low-Power Reactor No. 1, had been designed as a prototype for portable military reactors, compact power sources the Army envisioned deploying in remote Arctic and mountainous locations where conventional fuel resupply was logistically impractical. The Army imagined small reactor units powering radar installations, isolated outposts, forward bases in conditions where diesel fuel couldn't reach. The SL-1 was the proof of concept for that vision. a stripped-down, simplified design meant to demonstrate that military nuclear power was viable in remote settings. It had been operating for roughly 2 years and had accumulated a documented history of mechanical problems, unplanned shutdowns, and personnel difficulties that the Atomic Energy Commission had not been eager to publicize. The soldiers assigned to maintain it were young men in their early 20s who had received training sufficient for routine operation and largely inadequate for anything else. They worked with equipment containing enough fissile material to create a lethal event if the wrong things happened in the wrong sequence, and the institutional structure around them treated this as an acceptable condition of their work. The 3 men in the building on the night of January 3rd were Specialist John Burns, Specialist Richard McKinley, and Private Richard Legg. They were on a scheduled maintenance shift following the Christmas and New Year's holiday shutdown. The specific task they were performing when everything came apart was reconnecting the control rods to their drive mechanisms, a procedure that required manually lifting the central control rod a few inches and latching it back into the drive coupling. Every component of it was familiar. Every step had been completed without incident multiple times before. Nothing about the maintenance routine on the night of January 3rd should have ended any differently than every other time it had been performed. What the official investigation determined was that the central control rod had been pulled upward not a few inches, but approximately 20 inches. At 20 inches of withdrawal, the SL-1 reactor went prompt critical in a fraction of a second. Prompt criticality means the nuclear chain reaction became self-accelerating at a rate that no mechanical safety system in the world could interrupt. The energy released in that instant converted the surrounding water to steam at pressures the vessel was never designed to contain. The entire reactor assembly, weighing several tons, was driven upward more than 9 feet and smashed into the ceiling before crashing back down. The 3 men inside had no interval between the moment the rod reached full withdrawal and the moment the building became a kill zone. There was no warning sound, no vibration preceding the event, no fraction of a second in which any response was possible. The explosion simply happened at a speed that exceeded the capacity of human reaction, and everything inside that building was transformed. When the investigation teams were finally able to examine the interior, working in short-timed intervals to limit radiation exposure, what they documented was a scene that had been arrested mid-motion. The reactor vessel had crashed back down from the ceiling and sat in a displaced position. Debris from the explosion was embedded in the walls. Instruments that had been mounted on the monitoring panels were shattered or displaced. The physical evidence recorded in those early days of the investigation was extensive and detailed, and it produced a technical picture of the explosion itself with reasonable precision. What it also began to produce, through the interviews of everyone who had known or worked alongside the 3 men, was a human picture that the technical report would not include. The official conclusion was that the rod withdrawal was accidental, a procedural error, a momentary human lapse. The Atomic Energy Commission released its findings, expressed condolences to the families, reviewed its safety procedures, and moved on. What the investigation had uncovered, and what never appeared in any document available to the public, was considerably darker. John Burns and Richard McKinley were not simply co-workers assigned to the same maintenance rotation. Burns had been in a relationship with McKinley's wife. That relationship had been known to people at the station, had continued for some time, and had recently ended badly in ways that left Burns in a visible state of personal deterioration. In the weeks before January 3rd, multiple colleagues described him as erratic, withdrawn, and increasingly difficult to read. There were conversations that several of those colleagues recalled in specific detail when investigators came asking, conversations in which Burns had said things that disturbed the people who heard them, though nobody had formally acted on the disturbance. Supervisors acknowledged during interviews that something had been visibly wrong with him for weeks. Not one of them had escalated it through any official channel. Burns had unrestricted access to the reactor building. He had direct, personal, and immediate reason to be in an enclosed room with Richard McKinley on the night of the maintenance shift. When investigators turned to the mechanics of what had actually occurred, the accidental withdrawal explanation collapsed. A 20-inch control rod pull cannot happen through carelessness or a momentary lapse of attention. The rod was a heavy steel assembly requiring deliberate and sustained upward force to move. An inadvertent pull of a few inches was mechanically possible. A sustained withdrawal of 20 inches, applied specifically to the rod whose full extraction would guarantee prompt criticality, was not consistent with how accidental human error expresses itself in that type of equipment. Engineers who examined the event privately reached the same conclusion independently. To move that rod 20 inches required a grip, a deliberate application of force, and a sustained commitment to that force past every physical cue telling the person holding it to stop. It required a decision. Several investigators who worked the SL-1 case and later spoke about it outside any official capacity were consistent on this point. The most defensible conclusion from the physical evidence and the personnel history combined was that Burns withdrew that rod knowing what would happen. What their files contained, in assessments that never appeared in the public record, was the probable documentation of a murder-suicide carried out inside a military nuclear reactor by a soldier in personal crisis. What made the cover-up structurally possible was a fundamental conflict built into how nuclear accidents were investigated in 1961. The Atomic Energy Commission both operated the nuclear program and served as the primary investigative body for incidents within it. There was no independent oversight with investigative authority. No external body could compel access to the restricted findings or demand a public accounting of what investigators had privately concluded. The AEC wrote the report, classified what it chose to classify, and released whatever it determined the public should receive. In January 1961, with Kennedy newly inaugurated and the Soviet nuclear program advancing rapidly, a murder-suicide inside a government reactor was not a narrative the AEC was going to release. The investigation files were restricted. The private conclusions stayed private. The account the public received was constructed to foreclose further inquiry, and it worked. The families received nothing that resembled the truth. McKinley's family was given condolences for a man who was, by every available indication, the specific and intended target of what his colleague carried out. Legg's family received standard notifications framing their son's death around an accident he had no part in causing. The first responders who entered that building in the hours after the explosion absorbed radiation doses that some of them carried for the rest of their lives. They had gone in under a framework of understanding about the event that was false from the moment it was assembled. The AEC's obligation to the program came first. Its obligation to the people most directly harmed by what happened in that building came after everything else. Physical cleanup of the SL-1 site took years. Decontamination crews worked in timed rotational shifts, entering and exiting according to dosimeter readings rather than task completion. For the men who had worked at the National Reactor Testing Station and watched the investigation unfold, the gap between what they knew and what the official report said was not abstract. Several of them spent years afterward unable to discuss what they had seen or been told during the investigation, bound by the restrictions attached to the classified portions of the inquiry. Others who had no formal classification obligations simply found that raising questions about the official account led nowhere. The AEC controlled the records, controlled access to the physical site, and had no institutional interest in revisiting a conclusion that had already been publicly accepted. Families who sought additional information through official channels were redirected to the same published report they had already received. The more consequential legacy was the pattern of institutional information management it confirmed. The AEC's approach in January 1961: release a technically framed public account, restrict findings likely to generate public alarm, protect the program's credibility before protecting the historical record, appeared in recognizable form at every significant American nuclear incident that followed. 3 Mile Island. The scattered criticality accidents at national laboratories throughout the 1950s and 1960s that generated almost no public coverage. SL-1 was the first time that approach was applied to a lethal event on American soil, and the fact that the cover held that the official version remained the dominant version for decades established it as operationally viable for every institution that came after. John Burns was 22 years old. Richard McKinley was 27. Richard Legg was 22. All three received full military honors. All three were officially recorded as having died in the line of duty. The lead-lined caskets, the lead-lined vaults, the organs interred separately as radioactive waste. These were the physical facts of their deaths, standing in permanent contrast to the official language that described them. The SL-1 program was canceled. The portable military reactor concept was shelved. The building was demolished, the site buried, and the Atomic Energy Commission kept operating under the same institutional priorities it had demonstrated in the weeks after January 3rd. The investigation files exist. The interview records, the technical analyses, the private assessments of the investigators who concluded the rod withdrawal was deliberate. They are in those files. None of it has been incorporated into any official finding because no institution with authority over those records has chosen to revisit them. The official conclusion has not changed in more than 60 years. It is still, formally and permanently, an accident. A man pinned to the ceiling 8 feet off the ground. 2 men dead on the floor. Lead-lined caskets and organs buried as radioactive waste. A report that called it a procedural mishap and asked the country to look elsewhere. That is where the official story ends. It is not where the actual one does.